Types of archetypes and strategies with Professor Sliver. We will start today's lesson with the three main archetypes in Magic the Gathering. Other types of strategies usually stem from these, or they tend to be some sort of hybrid between archetypes. Let us begin. Aggro. This one is almost self-explanatory. Aggro decks seek to be aggressive, to finish the game as fast as possible, sacrificing late-game staying power or long-term strategies in favor of blistering speed and tons of redundancy. This basically means that aggro decks are looking to trade their cards for damage. They can be creature-based, direct damage-based, or a mixture of both. When they are creature-based, we can have Go Wide Aggro, which means quickly filling up the battlefield with a lot of smaller, more efficient creatures and maybe a couple of medium-sized creatures, or Go Tall Aggro, which means sticking one or two really big and powerful creatures into the battlefield, or turning a relatively small creature into a big one using auras or equipment. These Go Tall creatures are usually going to be difficult to deal with because of things like hexproof, indestructible, trample, etc. Midrange. These types of decks are usually very adaptive. They can pivot between being more aggressive / going under control decks, or more defensive / going bigger than aggro decks depending on each situation. If they fight against aggro, they can take the role of the control deck, and once they stabilize, they win with their superior threats. If they fight against control, they seek to be the aggressors, trying to deploy a fast enough clock and efficient disruption as best as possible. I like to consider midrange the jack of all trades when it comes to MTG archetypes. Great midrange decks are usually very good at many aspects of the game, but never the best at those aspects. They will never be as fast as aggro or as great at attrition games as control, but they make up for that with superior flexibility and adaptability. Control. They are also pretty self-explanatory. These decks seek to control the board and stall the game long enough to leave opponents without resources through 1-for-1, 2-for-1, and even many-for-1 interactions. Once the coast is clear, control decks might deploy one of their win conditions, which are usually extremely difficult to deal with and represent inevitability if left unanswered for just 1 or 2 turns. Ramp or big mana. These decks seek to gain access to more mana than their opponents at a much faster rate, and then proceed to cast some of the most powerful spells in the game. Their weaknesses include drawing all the ramp but none of the payoffs, drawing all the payoffs and none of the ramp, and many times lacking meaningful ways of interacting with their opponents. Combo. These decks seek to basically put the pieces of an engine together. 2 or more cards that interact with each other in such a way that it should most of the time result in instant victory. Depending on the nature of the engine that is sought to be assembled, combo decks will many times play cards more typically associated with midrange, control, ramp, tempo, stacks, reanimator, and other types of strategies. But combo as an archetype always values consistency, speed, and resilience. This means being able to put the pieces of the engine together regularly, fast enough to race for the win, and being able to protect the engine or withstand disruption and still win. Tempo. One of the hardest archetypes to classify / identify. In music, tempo refers to how fast or slow a song is. So basically, you pick the tempo that better suits your composition. In Magic the Gathering, tempo decks seek to dictate not the speed of the game per se, but how much can you accomplish during your turns in contrast to how much are you leaving your opponents behind. A lot of people consider tempo to be a hybrid between aggro and control, so in order to achieve such a unique strategy, tempo decks tend to have extremely low mana curves, loaded with extremely efficient threats and disruption. Like I said, this type of strategy is not easy to understand intuitively at first, so leave a comment below if you want a full video about tempo decks. Stacks. These types of strategies seek to, well, tax your opponents, making it harder and harder for them to play certain cards, or any cards at all for that matter, by denying them resources, using taxing effects, disruption, etc., etc. They share a lot in common with control. Stacks usually plays a slow attrition game until they reach the point of inevitability. Mill. We'll refer to actual rulings from the game in order to properly define mill. A player who attempts to draw a card from a library with no cards in it loses the game the next time a player would receive priority. If a player is required to draw more cards than are left in his or her library, he or she draws the remaining cards and then loses the game the next time a player would receive priority. If a player attempted to draw a card from a library with no cards in it since the last time state-based actions were checked, he or she loses the game. Mill decks seek to achieve any of what has just been mentioned, so this strategy consists of using cards and effects that make opponents mill their libraries. That usually refers, but is not restricted to, putting X number of cards from the top of their libraries into their graveyards, and keep doing so until there's nothing left and they lose the game by means of the previously stated rulings. Yeah, I didn't say it was the most efficient or awesome of strategies, but it exists and it keeps getting better with each new set, so if mill is your jam, mill into the sunset. Self-mill. The basic strategy is the same as regular mill, but in here you do it to yourself. Why would you do this to yourself? Because there are cards in Magic the Gathering that reward you for A. having cards placed from the top of your library into your graveyard, B. having a lot of cards in your graveyard, or C. having no library. Cases A and V will lead us to Reanimator, a strategy that seeks to put creatures or even other permanents, usually from but not restricted to your library, into the graveyard in order to bring them into the battlefield through other cards or effects. Reanimator strategies basically want to put creatures or other permanents into play from the graveyard at a much lower cost than they would if they simply play these cards directly from their hands. Tribal. A lot of creatures in Magic the Gathering, like elves, goblins, merfolk, or slivers, tend to greatly benefit from being surrounded by their own kind. Tribal strategies seek to exploit and abuse these interactions to overwhelm opponents. And that's it, my fellow student slivers. This was Types of Archetypes and Strategies 101. If you would like to see more of Professor Sliver, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, click on the notification bell so you never miss a new video, and above all, share this content with other slivers across the multiverse. That is truly the best way in which you can support your hive. Take care, my fellow slivers. We'll gather again on the next video. Class dismissed.